Thanks, Kelly. It's great to be able to speak today. I enjoyed the panel that just completed. So I'm going to try to cover some topics that I think are a little bit different than what folks have heard about before. The concept of reusable data and evidence networks and how that is transforming the research paradigm. We'll touch on traditional approaches versus this data network approach. I'll go into some of the details about how these things get built and where they get applied, and then the types of ways they can be utilized. And we'll have some time for questions. So just to get to the kind of the core concept about reusability, this is not our system. This is the SpaceX booster rocket. And the reason I show it is that reusability is a concept that's not new. It's just one that really has not been applied in the research paradigm very much. But say we do apply the concept of reusability, I think we see the same types of benefits that SpaceX sees, which is faster time to launch, more predictable and reliable, lower marginal costs for each new program, and over time, potentially massive cumulative savings. I'm going to refer to the Harvard Business Review article on the customer-centered innovation map for a second. For those of you who are familiar with it, it's really the concept of what we hire products to do. So we hire workers, word processing software to create documents, and surgeons hire scalpels to dissect soft tissue. So as we broaden the concept of what a product is and our need to hire the product to achieve a goal, we can think about hiring studies, registries, post-market programs to gather high-quality prospective data. That's the goal, not how we do it, but what we end up with. And researchers and regulators want high-quality data, and process is just the means to the end. So we really have an opportunity to innovate on the process, and that's the opportunity ultimately to improve the research paradigm around real-world data, post-market commitments, prospective studies, and so forth. So if we think about the traditional research paradigm, anyone who's in the clinical studies business will immediately recognize this linear path of protocol, site identification, contracting, data collection, first patient in, last patient out, and database lock. We see some levels of reusability. You can see the part of the linear measurement that I have contracted. Some parts of reusability where we are working with specific sites on a recurrent basis. We have in place template contracts, and we know their IRBs. They're familiar with an EDC system. But let's take that to the next step. What if we reinvent how we think about utilizing networks where data transfer, data cleaning, and extractions are ongoing? Our ability to link to other data sources are ongoing. And then as we layer on new protocols, it's really identifying the information from that feeding learning health system loop to bring data out and then lock that data. And we see this in certain programs, but certainly not enough programs. And I'll go into more detail on what constitutes a data network that can be used in this way. So what do I mean by a data network? So a data network is leveraging the fact that clinical care is recorded in systems of record. And by wiring to those systems of record, we can create the infrastructure to connect clinical sites and patients electronically. And then on top of that, we can add additional information capture that we need to meet a particular protocol requirement, real world data need. What makes these reusable? So the first thing that makes them reusable is they get integrated with electronic health record systems. There are different ways to integrate, and there are a number of different systems, and it does become a compounded problem. But for us, we focus in on particular specialties because in the US healthcare system, it's really specialists who see patients with chronic diseases, and that's our focus, chronic diseases over time, and record in different ways key information, key laboratories, and whether a patient is improving or worsening. That integration limits the burden to providers and enables them to be involved in many more programs that are collecting data. That type of infrastructure can enable learning health systems, which gives back information to the patient, to the provider, and it can meet evolving standards for real-world data regulatory submission if it's intended for that purpose. One of the key aspects of these reusable systems is actually going beyond just simply trying to capture data that's coded and structured. And that's leveraging the fact that information in most healthcare systems is captured in unstructured data, the clinical narrative, if you will. So we as physicians are taught to either dictate or write narratives. And the complexity and nuance of those narratives is where most of the key clinical information actually lives. Turning that narrative into structured information that can be extracted in a validated and reliable manner, validated sufficiently so that it can be presented for regulatory purposes, is the goal. And there are ways to do that, including curating with human abstractors, using automation or medical language processing to extract it, or using sentiment analysis to estimate certain endpoints with a high degree of reliability. Just looking at sample unstructured data from a patient in dermatology practice, we see that less than 1% of body surface area is currently affected, so we have a measurement of severity. We see a drug has been stopped because it has a side effect. So again, the information in the unstructured data is incredibly important, but even more important for the type of clinical research that we are all trying to do are endpoints. And one of the things that we now are able to do from unstructured data is begin to not only find endpoints and capture that information, but even estimate them. We have a recent publication in the British Medical Journal's rheumatology section just a few months ago explaining how this can be done for these very specific endpoints. Once we have a network in place, which involves both electronic connections and willing providers, we can also layer onto it additional data types that might be valuable in particular conditions, like patient-reported outcomes measurement, like image capture. So we're capturing images, for example, endoscopic images. In certain conditions, we're capturing photo images in dermatology and so forth. So this ability to incorporate images expands, again, how we can leverage these networks in an ongoing way. One of the big advances over the last decade has also been the ability to link data deterministically between different data files and sources. And we want to leverage this as extensively as we can to complete the patient journey in the information that we're capturing. That not only provides more information, but it provides the ability to cross-validate the information we might otherwise capture from the clinician in the medical record, because there's certain things that occur outside of the clinical site that we want to know about. A visit to a different hospital, emergency room, a death, etc. So those are the types of things we get by augmenting this with collection and linkage to medical and pharmacy claims. So routinely in our data sets, we are linking about 90% or more of the patients to our medical and pharmacy claims data, which we hold on over 300 million people in the US. Social determinants data is incredibly important. And there's certainly a lot of attention on that today. And we recently published a paper looking at racial disparities actually in access to breast cancer screening from a large database that's approaching 1 million women that we have been working on through this network approach. But many more things can be found with social determinants data. We have social determinants data on over 100 million people in the US that includes educational status, income level, even level of debt. And so the ability to link that kind of information adds a layer of features that can be incredibly important for these prospective studies, as well as for developing data science models and AI. And then I mentioned death data as something that doesn't occur within the context of a clinical setting most commonly, unless a patient expires in the hospital, but we need to obtain that information. And then, of course, information on the providers for a number of reasons. If we want to use the information to balance, and understand where we're getting patients from. So in some programs, we're submitting data to the FDA. One of the key questions is understanding and characterizing the sites and clinical investigators from whom the real world data is being provided, so they can understand whether or not we have similarities between the treated group and the comparator. So these are become incredibly important, and to do it at scale, and to do it not one at a time, but to do it across all these data sets at the same time is now a capability and technology that opens the door for feature-rich information. The other thing we always want to think about when we're using a data network to kind of augment or hopefully even replace some of the more arcane approaches to clinical research is quality standards. Many of you are familiar with the handbook Registries for Evaluating Patient Outcomes and Users Guide. I've been honored to be the principal investigator and senior author for that, or senior editor for a number of years and a number of editions. But this guide, the one we produced just about a year ago, the fourth edition, really now focuses on the specific requirements for using these types of networks, standards of capturing and collecting and leveraging electronic medical records and claims data in a continuous way for capturing observational data, prospective data, registry data, and so forth. But we have to go a step further. Many of you are familiar with the draft guidance that was put forward by the FDA recently on real-world data, assessing electronic health records and medical claims data to support regulatory decision-making. And this really outlined nicely, or in one place, the CDER's thinking on what's needed with respect to real-world evidence. And the good news is that this can be very much supported by the concept of these data networks that I've been describing. If we're able to use these data networks for prospective regulatory studies, we're able to meet all of these opportunities around real-world evidence uses that this is based on work published by the Duke Margolis group. We can go even a step further with these networks. Because the burden is off the providers, we're collecting data in some cases directly from the patient, the opportunity becomes to start thinking more about this as a community. Meaning, how can the participants in the community, the providers and the patients benefit from the data that are being collected about them, about their patients, in a way that will help care? So this is becoming an even more critical component of differentiating programs, is being able to build out these communities. So we've built out a number of data and evidence networks for chronic diseases. Again, networks of specialists who are electronically connected by their systems of record, with additional endpoints of interest for safety and other outcomes that can be collected in a regulatory and compliant way in conditions like, or specialties like, rheumatology, neuroscience, cardiovascular, metabolic diseases, dermatology, respiratory, GI, and others. Just to give you an example of how broad these networks can get. In neuroscience, our network currently brings data in from over 2,000, that's right, 2,000 practices in the US. You can see the heat map of patients, millions of active patients, longitudinal data since 2015, representing all 50 states for a number of different therapeutic areas that we can cover, ranging from MS to depression and anxiety disorders to autism. And the types of real-world data uses in neuroscience really span the gamut, from disease burden, disease mechanism, to trial feasibility, protocol planning, identifying sites for participation, as well as patients within those sites for participation, regulatory submission purposes, safety, adherence, effectiveness, understanding subtypes, utilization, and value-based contracting and personalized care. Just another network to bring this point home. We have an exclusive partnership with the American Academy of Dermatology that have been managing the DataDerm Registry, which is the largest dermatology network in the US, probably in the world. It now has 12 million patients, longitudinal since 2015. But on top of that network, where all of the electronic medical records are connected, and we're activate that network to collect additional information, we're collecting things like patient-reported outcomes data, clinician-reported outcomes data, images, and soon omics data. And just to give you an example, in atopic dermatitis, this network concept allows us to say, we're tracking 150,000 patients with atopic dermatitis. So from that, there's a registry of all comers with atopic dermatitis. There's a clinician-reported outcomes and patient-reported outcomes study, which is layering on top of that this type of additional key information that's not always collected in routine practice. And then yet another safety surveillance study that's following a lot of patients who are coming on to new treatments that need to be tracked for their safety. Other reusable data network examples are shown here, like in cardiovascular metabolic. conditions in rheumatology. We have about 15% of U.S. Practices, of the United States practices who are rheumatologists. Respiratory, we've combined pulmonologists and allergists with a medical specialty society, ENT, that represents 30% of practicing ENTs, and so forth. But there's another type of data network that may be of even equal interest to you, and that's sponsor-specific reusable data networks. And that's where we're working with a sponsor in an area that we have not developed an existing network, but where they want to have set up using the same technologies, a data network that they can leverage in a repeatable way for this paradigm. So an example is a women's health network where we have been collecting data at scale for several years. We've now enrolled about 1 million women. So about 1 million women are being followed regularly through this network. It's a massive program, and this is the case where I was describing earlier, our ability to look at, for example, racial disparities in breast cancer screening. Another program that we have added a layer of a network, or a sponsor-directed network, is in MS, where on top of the data we are already collecting that's very specific in MS, including both the clinical data as well as the endpoints, outcomes, subtypes, is we've extended the data network to enable the patients to participate and benefit from that participation through portals that are more specific to them. Another example is using this data for regulatory purposes, where we create a network of a more rare disease. So here, a more sponsor-specific data network is focused on a rare hematologic cancer. And what we're able to do with this is both develop a registry that's tracking the natural history of these patients, and then develop external control arms as well off of the same network to be able to be used for regulatory purposes. So this, again, is a way to leverage this network concept for multiple studies, meeting multiple objectives within a company in a disease area that lowers the burden and lowers the cumulative costs significantly over running independent studies in a more traditional way. Another program here, this is a relative rare disease. It's about 15 sites, which is being expanded. Again, multiple studies. There's a registry component that we're tracking prospectively. There's a patient-reported and caregiver-reported sub-study, and there are other programs going on through this network as well. Another example is to use this type of approach for post-market commitments. And the advantage here is certain types of post-market commitments are trying to achieve great scale. This is particularly true, for example, in diagnostics, where we need a lot of patients with a lot of follow-up, because if we're doing, for example, cancer diagnostics, we want to see what false negatives were, and that means we need to track patients over a period of time to ensure that they have not, in fact, developed a cancer with a negative screening test. And so that becomes the reason that these programs get to be 50,000 or more patients, and you simply can't do it through a traditional model. You could, but it's incredibly expensive, tens of millions of dollars. In this model, what we do is we're able to collect 100% of the patients that are seen with this particular case, follow them longitudinally, and leverage the data network for other types of programs as well. This is another example that I think is really exciting, which is leveraging what we call Patient Finder. So Patient Finder is a new type of modeling that leverages the data we bring in from these data networks that, I described having clinical data, having medical and pharmacy claims data, having death data, having social determinants data, that these data can, in fact, provide tremendous features for being able to develop AI models that can actually help us find these patients. And so by that, I mean, as we develop a model using a platform we call Patient Finder, we can then run that against a health system to identify patients who have the condition of interest. So here's an example of using that in rare lysosomal storage disease. We've previously presented this at the WORLD conference, but here we have patients who have a rare disease that's generally identified about 1 in 50,000 patients, or maybe even fewer. What we're able to do with the patient finder is use that feature-rich capability to develop a model that can then run against the health system's data and increase the likelihood of finding patients by many, many fold, going to about 1 in 100, where then it becomes reasonable to have those patients undergo actually genotyping to confirm the diagnosis. So in summary, there is a better approach to prospective research. This concept of reusable data and evidence networks connecting to systems of record and allowing for new data collection from clinicians and patients is, I think, the new way research will be done. And automation is what changes the paradigm. As I described from that Harvard Business Review article, we hire programs to collect key data. What we want in the end are the data, and we want that data to be high quality and sometimes regulatory quality. And we can leverage electronic systems where they exist, where they're obtaining high quality data, and not where they're not, to reduce burden and selection bias while increasing patient numbers and ultimately follow-up. From a use of other data sources, both direct and linked data fills in the gaps. So what we want to do is leverage direct provider or patient entry and other data sources through deterministic linkage, because that often comes up. So deterministic linkage to complete that picture. I described death data use, so that death data for particular purposes might be from Social Security death indices or obituaries, or other cases we'll use the National Death Index, again, depending on the timing, the reasons for capturing the death data, and the ultimate use, whether that's for regulatory purposes or not. We want to enhance value to providers and patients, both because we're able to do it, but it improves durability of the program. So creating these learning healthcare systems improves the value of these programs for every stakeholder and really gives something back to the clinics, to the patients in the course of these programs and studies that is really the reason for them to participate. And ultimately faster, more reliable and predictable and lower costs. So again, there's huge investment that goes into research, into real world data and real world evidence. And what we see is this approach is dramatically improving cost efficiency, timelines, and the breadth of evidence generation for sponsors.
Thank you, Rich. That was a great presentation. So to the audience, first of all, if you have seen in the chat, the organizer has asked you to see if you can answer some of the questions listed through the polls tab. So this is a creative, interactive online platform that if you can help OM1 to get some of your perspectives, that will be really helpful. So Rich, there are some questions for you. So let me just ask you, the first question is, have you applied your patient finder technology for less rare but underdiagnosed conditions?
Yeah, that's actually a great and perceptive question. So yes, we have. So an example is we have a patient finder model that works for treatment-resistant depression. It actually has an area under the curve of 0.92. So treatment-resistant depression is not well coded, it's not well identified, but it's certainly not identified in patients early enough to alter their course of care. So that would be an example. We do the same thing in identifying underdiagnosed NASH patients. So we all know there's a NASH epidemic, but it's really hard to find NASH patients in coded data because until you have a biopsy, you're often not coded as having NASH. It's another example. Great question.
Thank you, Rich. So another question is that for a sponsor-directed network, what kind of cost efficiencies might a sponsor see in adding the second or third studies to a reusable network?
Yeah, another good question, and right to the heart of it, right? What is the value of doing this? And we've actually looked at this pretty closely. Interestingly, it's very similar to what SpaceX reports for their reusable rockets, in that the second study or third study can be reduced in cost by 40 to 50%.
That's very impressive. So one more question, Rich. Several of your networks are very large. For example, 15% of the US rheumatologists and even 2,000 psychiatry practices. For example, the American Academy of Dermatology, so on and so forth. Do you have a similar footprint in ex-US countries, for example, Europe? Do you have any plans? And I think a lot of people have asked about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a great question. Let's say we're building. It's a little harder, as folks know, in Europe and Asia, but we are working through partnerships and building to hopefully offer something similar over the next few years.
So thank you, Rich. You have 3 more minutes. So since we still have a couple of minutes for you to really give us some final thoughts.
Yeah, I think that the one thing I really didn't get into in great detail, but I referred to it both by how we're collecting data and massively linking it, as well as the what you can do with Patient Finder, is we are starting to reach the point where you can get comprehensive real world data that's super feature rich by having all of these data elements endpoints, and that just opens the barn doors for what AI can do. AI, as you know, Kelly, from your own work, AI really depends on high quality features, and the more feature rich it is. So that's what we're getting by massively linking specialty data with lots of endpoints that's clinically deep. And I think that's going to change not only what we're able to do from a research perspective, but what we're able to do from a practice, clinical practice perspective. To me, that is why I get up in the morning, go to work, or sit at my house and go to work on Zoom. But I think that's what's so exciting about this field right now.
That's very well said, Rich. And also, everyone, Adam, who's one of the organizers, actually put down some resources from OM1. If you can see in the comments section, essentially you can, take a look and check out OM1's virtual booth. Actually, I did yesterday, so it's very well, organized. So hopefully you really enjoy Rich's talk. And if you have any further questions, make sure to connect with OM1.
Thank you. Thanks all. Thanks, Kelly. Take care.
Thanks, Rich.